The day they let me go, I remember thinking the conference room smelled like bad coffee and cheaper decisions. My director, I'll call him my director because that's what he was, not a mentor, not a colleague, just a title above mine on an org chart, sat across from me with a folder he never opened. HR was there too, a woman I'd seen maybe 3 times in 4 years. She had a notepad. She didn't write anything down. "We're restructuring the division," he said. "Your role is being eliminated." That was it. No preamble. No acknowledgement of the Belmore contract I'd spent 11 months closing. No mention of the $67 million in new revenue I'd brought through the door in a single fiscal year. Just, "Your role is being eliminated." Like I was a line item. Like I was overhead. I asked if there was a performance issue. He said no. I asked if this was related to the Belmore deal falling under the new compliance framework. He looked at HR. She looked at her blank notepad. "We just need to move in a different direction," he said. I nodded. I thanked them for the time. I shook both their hands, and then I walked back to my desk, sat down in my chair one last time, and looked at the framed copy of my employment contract I kept in the bottom drawer. Not because I'm sentimental, because I'd read it so many times I knew exactly what page 41 said. Let me back up. I came to Hargrove Industrial Solutions in the winter of 2019. I was 43 years old. I'd spent 15 years in B2B sales and contract development, and I'd been recruited specifically to build out their enterprise accounts division in the Southeast. The company had strong manufacturing roots, solid Midwest clientele, but they were bleeding market share in the Gulf Coast corridor. They needed someone who knew how to work with regional buyers, state procurement offices, the kind of clients who shake your hand twice before they read your proposal. I knew that world. I grew up in it. The deal they offered me was good. Base salary, standard benefits, equity stake that vested over 4 years. But the clause that made me sign was on page 41. It read, and I'm paraphrasing from memory, but not by much, that in the event of termination without cause, the employee shall be entitled to a lump sum payment equivalent to 14% of net new revenue generated by accounts directly sourced and closed by said employee during the preceding fiscal year. 14% of net new revenue, not profit, revenue. I remember my attorney at the time flagging it. He said, "You know this number could be significant if you have a strong year." I told him that was the point. I'd negotiated it specifically because I believed in what I was being hired to do, and I wanted skin in the game. If I performed, I wanted the company to feel it on both ends. They agreed. The VP of HR at the time, a man who retired 18 months later, initialed every page. I filed it. And I didn't think about it again for 4 years. Those 4 years were good ones. Not easy, but good. I built the Southeast division from a 2-person operation into a team of 9. We landed accounts in Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, and Alabama that the company had been circling for years without success. I drove a lot of miles. I ate a lot of bad truck stop food and sat in a lot of county commissioner waiting rooms. I learned the name of every receptionist at every facility that mattered. My best hire during that time was a young guy I brought on in 2021. I'll call him my analyst because he was, and because he mattered to this story later. Sharp kid, numbers brain. He could find the flaw in a procurement bid the way a surgeon finds a vein. I paid him below market because that's what our budget allowed, but I fought for every bonus he got, and I made sure he knew it. The Belmore contract was his as much as mine. Belmore Industrial Group was a private conglomerate out of Birmingham. They sourced fabricated components for defense-adjacent infrastructure projects, not classified but government-adjacent, which meant their procurement process was meticulous, and their payment terms were even better. I'd been cultivating the relationship for 14 months. My analyst had built the pricing model. We'd revised the proposal 9 times. We closed it in March of 2023, $67.2 million over 3 years with a renewal option. I got a congratulatory email from the CEO. He CC'd the whole leadership team. He used the word transformative. 11 weeks later, I was sitting in that conference room with the unopened folder and the woman with the blank notepad. The official termination date was May 18th. Our annual performance bonuses, a separate structure from my contract clause, paid to all eligible employees, were scheduled to be distributed on June 1st. The threshold for eligibility was continuous employment through May 31st. I was terminated 13 days before that date. I don't think it was a coincidence. I know it wasn't. What I didn't know yet, what I would spend the next 6 weeks piecing together, was why. Because restructuring made no sense. My division was the fastest growing segment of the company. My numbers were clean. My team had zero compliance issues. We had a $67 million contract actively generating revenue. So I called a contact I trusted, not someone inside the company. A former colleague who'd left Hargrove 2 years earlier and still had friends there. She'd heard things. She told me she'd heard there was pressure coming from the parent company. Hargrove had been acquired 18 months earlier by a holding group out of Atlanta, and that the new ownership was restructuring compensation across all acquired companies. Specifically, they were eliminating what they called legacy incentive structures, meaning unusual contractual terms that didn't fit their standardized model. She said my name had come up specifically. She said someone had done the math on what my contract clause would pay out at the end of the fiscal year, and the number had made someone very uncomfortable. I thanked her. I sat with that for a night. Then I called my attorney. He'd moved firms since 2019, but he still had a copy of everything. He pulled up the contract on a Tuesday afternoon and we went through it together over the phone. The clause was clean, no ambiguity, no sunset provision, no carve-out for acquisition or corporate restructuring. Termination without cause triggered the payment, full stop. They're going to argue the accounts weren't solely sourced by you, he said. They can try, I said. Every client file has my signature on the initial outreach. My analyst's role was advisory and analytical. The contract language says directly sourced and closed. I was the relationship. I was the closer. He was quiet for a moment. Do you have documentation? I had documentation going back to 2019. I had saved every email thread, every meeting note, every call log from my CRM, every proposal draft, every revision, every signed letter of intent. My analyst, God bless him, had kept parallel records because he was that kind of meticulous. I had 4 years of paper trail in a Dropbox folder I'd maintained on my personal account, because I'd learned long ago never to trust that company servers would be accessible if you ever needed them most. What are we looking at? I asked. My attorney pulled up the revenue figures from the most recent annual report, cross-referenced with my account list. He told me the number. 14% of net new revenue from accounts I'd directly sourced and closed in fiscal year 2023 came to $9,408,000. I wrote it down on a piece of paper. $9,408,000. I looked at it for a long time. The company's response, when my attorney sent the initial demand letter, was roughly what I expected. Their legal team came back with 3 arguments. First, they claimed the Belmore contract, which represented the bulk of my qualifying revenue, had been a team effort, and therefore couldn't be attributed solely to me for purposes of the clause calculation. Second, they argued that the acquisition by the Atlanta Holding Group constituted a material change in corporate structure that effectively voided legacy employment terms not explicitly adopted by the new entity. Third, they claimed that 14% of revenue was a clerical error in the original contract and that the intended figure was 14% of net profit, not revenue. I'll take those in order. On the first argument, I had the initial Belmore contact email sent from my personal work account, dated January 2022. I had 14 months of email correspondence between myself and Belmore's procurement director, a man I'd met at an industry conference in New Orleans in 2021, documenting every phase of the relationship. My analyst's role was explicitly described in internal communications as proposal modeling and pricing analysis. He was not the relationship. He was not in the room when we closed it. He would tell you the same thing himself, and eventually he did, in a signed statement. On the second argument, the acquisition agreement between Hargrove's original ownership and the Atlanta Holding Group was a matter of public record, filed with the Georgia Secretary of State's office. My attorney obtained it. Nowhere in that document did it state that existing employment contracts were voided or modified. In fact, there was standard successor liability language that explicitly obligated the acquiring entity to honor all existing contractual obligations. On the third argument, the original contract, initialed on every page by Hargrove's then VP of HR, clearly read net new revenue, not profit. Revenue. The word profit does not appear in that clause. My attorney had the original. So did I. So, presumably, did they just apparently hoped I didn't. We responded to all 3 points with documentation. Their attorneys went quiet for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, something else happened. My analyst called me. He'd stayed on after I left. He had a mortgage and a baby on the way, and I didn't begrudge him a single day of it. But he'd been watching things, and he was troubled. He told me that shortly after my termination, someone from the Atlanta Holding Group's finance team had begun reviewing the Belmore contract files, not auditing them, reviewing them, specifically the revenue attribution. He said there were conversations happening about how the contract was categorized in the system. He wasn't sure what it meant, but he didn't like the way it felt. I told him to document everything he saw and heard, not to share confidential information, not to do anything that could cost him his job, but to keep his own records. He said he already was. 2 weeks later, the company came back with a revised position. They were willing to acknowledge the clause. But they proposed a figure of $1.1 million, roughly 12 cents on the dollar, citing what they called revenue attribution adjustments that reduced my qualifying account base. In other words, they'd moved Belmore off my account list in their internal system. Retroactively, my attorney sent me the email on a Friday afternoon. I read it twice. Then I called him back and said, let's go to litigation. Filing suit against a company with in-house counsel and a holding group behind them is not a decision you make lightly. I want to be honest about that. I had savings. I had a wife who worked and believed in me and never once, not once, suggested I back down. I had an attorney who'd known me for 4 years and believed the case was winnable. But there were nights I sat at the kitchen table running numbers on a legal pad and the math got heavy. The discovery process is where cases like this are decided. Either you have the documentation or you don't. We had it. Every email, every call log, every proposal revision. My analyst's signed statement, the original contract with every initial on every page, the acquisition agreement with the successor liability clause, the internal Hargrove communications, which we obtained through discovery, showing that Belmore had been reclassified in their revenue tracking system on May 22nd, 4 days after my termination. May 22nd, 4 days after. Our legal team filed a motion arguing spoliation, that the company had altered material records relevant to my claim. That motion alone shifted the posture of the entire case. Their lead attorney called my attorney on a Thursday morning in November. She said their client was interested in exploring a resolution. I was not surprised. We mediated in December in a conference room in downtown Atlanta. Neutral mediator, both legal teams, no executives present. I don't want to get into every detail of the mediation, but I'll tell you this. They came in with a number. We declined. We showed them what discovery had produced. They recessed for an hour. They came back with a different number. We negotiated from there. The final settlement was $8,200,000. It was not the full contractual amount. My attorney advised that the certainty of settlement, given the time and expense of trial, outweighed the marginal gain of litigating to the maximum figure. I agreed with him. I want to be precise about what $8,200,000 is and is not. It is not a lottery win. It is not found money. It is 4 years of my professional life, 14 months of cultivating a single relationship, 9 rounds of proposal revisions, and the specific foresight to negotiate a contract clause that protected the value I knew I could create. It is also the cost of 7 months of legal fees and the particular kind of stress that lives behind your eyes when you're in a dispute of that magnitude. But it is mine, every dollar. The NDA they requested was standard. What I negotiated was this. I would agree not to disparage specific individuals by name. I would not, however, agree to any provision that prevented me from discussing the existence or general nature of the dispute or from speaking about my own contractual rights in an educational context. Their attorneys pushed back. My attorney pushed back harder. They signed my version. There's something I want to say about my analyst. When this was all done, I called him. He'd stayed at Hargrove, and I respected that completely. I told him so. He had a daughter by then, 3 months old, and I asked him to send me a photo, which he did. I told him I wanted to compensate him for his time, his documentation, his statement, his willingness to do the right thing when it would have been easier not to. He told me he didn't want money. I told him I wasn't asking his permission. I won't say the amount, but it was meaningful. He earned it. I also want to say something about my wife. She sat across from me at that kitchen table for 7 months of uncertainty, and she never once shifted. Not once. I've been in a lot of conference rooms. I've negotiated with a lot of people. She is the most steady person I have ever met. This wasn't her battle, and she made it hers anyway. I don't have words for that aren't inadequate. So I'll just say, she knows. If you've read this far, here's what I actually want you to take away. Employment contracts are not formalities. They are binding legal documents, and the language in them matters precisely because most people never read them closely enough to know what they've actually agreed to, or what they've actually been given. When I negotiated page 41, the company's attorneys thought it was generous but manageable. They were thinking about an average year. I was thinking about what I was capable of building. Both of us were right about different things. Read your contract, every page. If you don't understand a clause, ask an attorney. If something looks unusual in your favor, don't downplay it. Understand it. Know exactly what triggers it, what qualifies it, and what documentation you would need if you ever had to enforce it. I kept records for 4 years, not because I expected to need them. I kept records because I was taught early in my career that the person who controls the documentation controls the narrative. They thought they could rewrite the story by moving a contract to a different column in a spreadsheet 4 days after I walked out the door. They forgot I still had the original draft. I left corporate sales after the settlement. I do consulting work now, contract development, mostly, helping mid-sized companies structure their enterprise agreements. I work from home. I take calls in the morning and I'm done by 2. My wife and I bought a piece of land in Tennessee we'd been talking about for years. It's quiet here. I like quiet. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't go to the press or post anything on LinkedIn in the heat of the moment. I just waited and documented and let the contract I'd signed 4 years earlier do what I'd always believed it would do. That's the whole story. That's all of it. Some battles don't require a raised voice. They just require patience, paperwork, and the presence of mind not to panic when the room goes cold. I had all 3. Turns out that was enough. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. The land in Tennessee is quiet in the mornings. Genuinely quiet. The kind you don't find inside a career. And in that quiet, I've thought a lot about cause and effect. Not in any mystical sense, just in the plain, observable way that choices accumulate. My director made a choice to walk into that conference room with a folder he never opened. Whoever made the call to reclassify Belmore in their system 4 days after my termination made a choice. The attorneys who drafted the response calling my contract language a clerical error, knowing full well it wasn't, made a choice. Those choices didn't happen in a vacuum. They happened because somewhere along the way, those people had learned that documentation disappears, that employees panic, that the path of least resistance is usually just to accept what you're told and move on. They were right about most people. They were wrong about me. And I want to be honest about why they were wrong, because I don't think it was anything exceptional about my character. I think it was preparation. I kept records because I was taught to keep records. I read the contract because I had an attorney who told me to read the contract. I negotiated page 41 because I believed in the value I was going to create, and I wanted that belief formalized. None of that is genius. It's just the discipline of taking your own work seriously enough to protect it. What I've come to believe, and I mean this without any pretense, is that integrity is a form of long-term strategy. Not because good things always happen to good people. That's not true, and I won't pretend otherwise. But because the record you build over time, and how you work and how you treat people, becomes the architecture of everything you can prove later. My analyst gave a signed statement on my behalf because he'd watched me fight for his bonuses for 2 years. My wife held steady through 7 months of uncertainty because she'd seen, over the course of a marriage, what kind of person I actually am. The documentation was clean because I'd never had any reason to hide anything. They tried to rewrite the story. They couldn't because I'd been writing it accurately the whole time. The settlement didn't change who I am. But it confirmed something I'd suspected for a long time, that the people who take shortcuts eventually run out of ground to stand on. Not always quickly. Not always publicly. But eventually the paperwork catches up. The emails surface. The dates on the reclassification timestamps don't match the story they're trying to tell. If you're somewhere in the middle of your own version of this, fighting for something that's rightfully yours, not sure if the math is going to work out, I'm not going to promise you a number. I'm going to tell you to document everything, know what your contract actually says, and don't let anyone talk you into believing that what's written down doesn't mean what it says. It means exactly what it says. That's the whole point of writing it down.